morning, Professor McMahon. Thank you for participating in this mock session of the Jean Monnet Network on EU-China relations, and specifically about your work on China and the European Union's strategic autonomy. First of all, we would like to ask you, how and why do you use academic publications to research Chinese narratives about relations with the European Union?
Quite a bit of psychological research that suggests that narratives or stories are really fundamental to how we understand the world. And this goes for international relations as well. China-EU relations is really central to global politics at the moment. So are we going to be convinced by stories about these two powers as partners or as adversaries? Empirically, we're looking at narratives in published academic articles where the lead authors are based in the People's Republic of China, so not Taiwan, not Hong Kong. And we've tailored our search terms to focus on EU-China relations in global governance of trade, investment and climate. And that includes China's Belt and Road Infrastructure Investment Initiative. We've also looked for articles on that are referring to European sovereignty and strategic autonomy. We chose academics because, well, first of all, their discussions in their publications are very comprehensive. They're giving a very detailed discussion of Chinese foreign policy. But we think they also offer an insight into China's very opaque official policy debate. One reason why that is because they've trained the elites. They're also influencing policy because they're expected and often commissioned to provide confidential expertise to the ministries, for example. They have something like the same socialization as the elites in politicalized, as the official elites, in politicized universities. There's something of a revolving door, as there is in Washington, between academia and officialdom, especially the diplomatic service. Chinese academic writing culture, in political science at least, has a very strong national service ethic, much more than in the West. Chinese articles are liable to suggest policy reforms in order to improve the prospects of Chinese policy. Articles we examine say things like they're openly declaring that they're offering a Chinese perspective, or declaring themselves committed to the fundamental, urgent mission to serve the company's interests. And you even get regime propaganda language praising the Belt and Road Initiative for making steady strides forward thanks to Beijing's all-out efforts, enormous political resolution and diplomatic ingenuity. A final reason why we expect the academic work to provide an insight into the official policy debates is censorship, setting strict constraints, limits to academic expression. One interviewee told me that academics have to be careful to avoid immediate trouble if they say something or if they write something that's wrong. I would still say that they have less constrained diversity of views than the officials do. They have to stick to the party line much more, and probably also the media. So you get a wider view by looking at this debate by looking at the academics. In concrete terms, we qualitatively identified narratives in the most highly cited academic articles since 1999, defined by our research terms. And roughly were from Google Scholar, the biggest academic database in English, and then half in Chinese from its Chinese equivalent, CNKI.
Thank you, Professor. Secondly, what are the most prominent narratives about China-EU relations?
We think there are two crucial narratives. One is the traditional one that has been the dominant narrative since the 1990s. This is the idea of win-win cooperation between China and the West, China and the EU, or constructive engagement. So the idea is that this engagement is economically profitable for both sides, and that China will increasingly act as a good citizen in global governance and participate in global governance. China really would like to preserve this as the core narrative, but it is increasingly challenged in the West and in Europe by the other main narrative, which is that of a new Cold War. In the last decade or a little longer, you've had a ratchet towards increasing hostility and suspicion. It's like the 20th century Cold War in that you have a language of ideological confrontation from the West, of democracy versus authoritarianism. You have a sub-narrative of the China threat to the US-led global liberal order. China rejects this as a Western narrative, but in its own words and deeds, it has also become more hostile and confrontational. The new Cold War narrative as applied to the EU is about divide and rule. China is accused of dealing separately with the EU member states, dividing them from one another and undermining integration. It's widely understood to be what's happening from the Western side. One Western academic said that China was sabotaging European integration with something close to contempt. And this is especially supposedly happening in Central and Eastern Europe. However, in the Chinese works that we examined, you don't have this. They are overwhelmingly praising and supporting the EU as a policy model, as a global actor, as being important for China, they're supporting integration, and especially they are praising the EU as a partner for China. This is over a long period. This has continued. There are even complaints that there is insufficient integration. It's being undermined by the self-interest of member states, and it would be better for China to be able to deal with a single Europe. We think that this is driven by what we see as the core narrative of China-EU relations since the 1990s on the Chinese side, among Chinese media, elites, general public. And this, we call this the multipolar partnership narrative. So in this, a sovereign Europe is being welcomed as another pole in the multipolar world. There's a realist IR logic here that's as implacable as physics, where you have two rising global powers. And the theory is that they should quasi-automatically balance against the unjust US unipolar hegemony. This is the term that's usually used. So the scholars we looked at, they talk about the EU seeking relative independence from the US, that its strategic intention is to become an important pole, even a superpower. And there are suggestions also that a united Europe could support China on the world stage, or is needed at least for this purpose, including as key order shapers in global governance. Articles talk about the US, China, Europe strategic triangle, and that the EU has an important role in this, affecting the balance of power. One article suggests that if you have closer transatlantic relations, that this could hurt China. Another, that closeness between China and the EU, for example, through a comprehensive investment agreement, could undermine transatlantic relations.
Lastly, have Chinese scholars been over-optimistic in their assessment of European sovereignty?
We think that probably they have. Over recent years, you've had an intensifying demand that the EU should act internationally as a sovereign actor. And we think that this challenges the multipolar partnership narrative in this Chinese core narrative, whether the Chinese recognize this or not. So the articles we're reading, they're welcoming the EU as an autonomous geopolitical actor, distinct force in the world. Half of those that explicitly discuss European sovereignty or strategic autonomy are positive about it, calling it a breakthrough in integration, responding to popular demands, aiming to protect Europe, and avoiding Europe's relegation to a spectator in the game of great powers, completely losing its international influence. There are worries also that the EU might fall firmly to the US camp without realizing its strategic autonomy. These articles don't anticipate that the EU will definitely be an ally of China, more that it will be neutral, that it seeks a strategic balance or third way, relative independence from the US. However, there's a minority, a third of the articles specifically discussing strategic autonomy or sovereignty, are recognizing the potential that there can be frictions or competition or less economic dependence on China as a result of this sovereignty. They also worry about the Commission's geopolitical Europe slogan, because it frames China as the main rival and competitor. Some canonical authors are very happy for the Belt and Road Initiative to broaden China's influence and active involvement in Central and Eastern Europe. And they're saying that the partner countries there should balance between Beijing and Brussels. But there's a couple of articles that recognize that the EU has drastically different views about the Belt and Road and worries about its impact on EU cohesion. And so these articles fear that the EU would counter China and the BRI's growing economic presence and political influence in Central and Eastern Europe. Stepping away from the Chinese articles, there's not a lot of recognition that the Xi Jinping regime is really turning Europeans off. Europeans are far more ambivalent about the China threat narrative than Americans are, but Xi's nationalism and authoritarianism are powerfully stimulating European sovereignty narratives against a China threat. So examples of this are China's economic and judicial coercion against countries like Lithuania. And then during COVID, the perception that China was manipulative and propagandistic. There's fears of dependence on Chinese PPE. There are worries about Xi's close partnership with Putin, despite the invasion of Ukraine. And you also have a shift in the European narratives of sovereignty from strategic autonomy towards sovereignty. Strategic autonomy is very much traditionally a French proposed idea about projecting Europe's military power externally into the world as a whole, autonomously from the US. Now, in recent years, especially as Atlanticist Germany has been recruited to the sovereignty agenda, there's been a movement towards a redefinition of autonomy as sovereignty, defending Europe's internal affairs from foreign coercion. So this broadens sovereignty narratives to digital, technological, economic data sovereignty. And these are fields where China and the EU interact much more than in the military strategic domain. So, for example, European sovereignty involves freezing Huawei, a Chinese telecoms company, out of the construction of 5G mobile network.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your participation. It has been a pleasure.
Thanks very much.